All right, everybody, get ready, because today we're diving deep into Romans 11.
Ooh, Romans 11.
This chapter tackles this really complex relationship between Israel and the Gentiles and God's plan for salvation. And we've got all kinds of resources here, study guides and timelines, and even some FAQs to help us unpack this one.
This is going to be a tough one.
Yeah, let's see what we can find.
It is a fascinating puzzle, that's for sure.
It is.
Paul, who wrote Romans, does an incredible job of navigating that tension between God's covenant with Israel and the fact that the Gentiles are now included.
Yeah.
It's this mystery that plays out over centuries, and it really shows God's grace and wisdom.
And it starts out with a bang, right, in Romans 11.1.
Oh, yeah.
Hath God cast away his people? That's a big question.
That's a heavy question.
Yeah, one that people have been asking throughout history.
Absolutely. And Paul doesn't shy away from it at all.
No.
And what's really interesting is how he uses his own Jewish background to kind of hammer home the point. He says, I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin.
Right.
So this isn't just some theoretical debate for him. It's deeply personal.
It's like he's saying, hey, I'm one of them. I get it. And then he used the example of Elijah, who felt totally alone in his faith.
Right.
Like he was the only one left.
It's that feeling of being surrounded by people who have lost their way, you know?
Yeah, for sure.
Like in 1 Kings 19, Elijah's just defeated.
All right.
He feels like he's the only one who's still faithful to God.
Yeah.
He even cries out to God and says, they've killed your prophets, they've torn down your altars, I'm the only one left, and they're trying to kill me too.
Wow.
And I think a lot of people can relate to that feeling.
Oh, for sure.
That isolation, like you're holding on to your beliefs when it feels like everyone else is drifting away.
Yeah, like you're the only one left in the wilderness, but then God reassures Elijah. He says to him, I have reserved 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and all whose mouths have not kissed him.
Right, and that's where this crucial idea of the remnant comes in.
Okay.
It's the idea that even when unfaithfulness seems like it's everywhere, there's always a group, a remnant, who stay true to God.
Right.
It's like a tiny ember keeping that fire of faith alive.
Okay.
When everything else has gone cold.
That's a great image.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what Paul's getting at in Romans 11.5, where he says, so too, at the present time, there is a remnant chosen by grace.
Right.
This powerful reminder that God always has a faithful people. Even when it looks like everyone else has gone astray.
Absolutely. And it's not about earning your way into this remnant.
Right.
It's about God's grace.
Yeah, undeserved favor.
Exactly. It's not based on their works or anything they've done. It's solely by God's grace.
Okay.
And this leads us into one of the most debated passages in Romans.
Yeah.
The idea of Gentiles being grafted in to God's plan.
Okay. Paul uses this supervided analogy of the olive tree.
Yes. The olive tree analogy.
To explain the relationship between Israel and the Gentiles.
This is one of my favorites. It's such a powerful image.
It is.
So we've got this cultivated olive tree representing Israel.
Yeah.
And then you've got these wild olive branches, which are the Gentiles, being grafted in.
It's like God is taking something wild, untamed, and making it part of something beautiful and fruitful.
Right, exactly. But then it gets even more interesting.
It does.
Because it's not about the Gentiles repulsing Israel.
Right.
It's more like God's using this strategy.
Yeah, like a strategic move.
Yeah, to provoke Israel to jealousy and ultimately draw them back to himself.
That's right.
Provoke to jealousy. So, like, God's using a little reverse psychology.
It's fascinating, right?
It is. It's fascinating.
It's like God is saying, look, I'm extending my grace to everybody.
Right.
Even those who were outside the covenant. Don't you want to be a part of this too?
That's incredible.
It is. But there's a warning here too, right?
There is.
Especially for us Gentile believers.
Yeah.
Like, don't get too proud.
Don't get cocky.
Yeah, exactly.
Paul's very clear about that. He warns against boasting.
Right.
And reminds Gentile believers, you do not support the root, but the root supports you. Don't forget, he says, you're grafted into the root, which is Israel.
Yeah.
Without that root, you can't produce any fruit.
So there's this picture of interdependence.
Yeah, beautiful picture.
Both are grafted into this one olive tree, both getting life from the same source. But what about the future of Israel?
Right.
Like, what about their ultimate salvation?
Well, that's where Romans 11 takes us next.
Okay.
And that's where we see just how deep God's mystery and faithfulness really are.
All right, let's get into that. I'm already hooked.
Okay, well, Romans 11.25 talks about this partial hardening that's happened to Israel. It's like a veil that's covering their eyes,
Right.
keeping them from fully recognizing Jesus as the Messiah. But, and this is crucial, it's not permanent.
Right, because Romans 11.26 says all Israel will be saved. What does that even mean?
Yeah, that's a big statement.
It is. How will it happen?
So it's important to understand that all Israel doesn't necessarily mean every single individual.
Right.
It's more about the ultimate restoration of Israel as a nation.
Right.
A fulfillment of God's covenant promises. It's this remarkable picture of God's faithfulness, even when his people have strayed.
So even though right now it might seem like Israel's far from God,
Yeah.
there's this incredible promise that one day they'll be fully restored.
That's right.
And that has impacts not just for Israel, but for the whole world, right?
Absolutely. Think about it. If God can orchestrate such a complex plan over generations, imagine what he can do in our lives.
Right.
What blind spots might he be working to remove in us?
Wow.
What might his grace be leading us toward?
That's powerful. And it all comes back to this idea that God's plan is so much bigger
It is.
than we can possibly grasp.
It's way bigger.
There's so much depth and complexity to it.
Absolutely.
It really is awe-inspiring.
And Paul captures that perfectly in the final verses of Romans 11.
Yeah.
He just breaks out in this praise of God's wisdom and knowledge, acknowledging how unsearchable his ways are.
It's like he's saying, look, we might not understand all the details,
Right.
but we can trust that God is in control.
Yeah.
And his plan is ultimately for good.
Absolutely.
And even amidst the mystery, there's a sense of peace
Yeah.
and wonder in that.
It is humbling, isn't it?
It is.
To realize just how vast and intricate God's plan really is.
It is. But you're right. There is that comfort
Yeah.
in surrendering and trusting that God knows what he's doing,
Right.
even when we don't have all the answers.
Exactly.
But going back to this idea of Israel's future salvation,
Okay.
what does that actually look like? I mean,
Right.
there's so many different interpretations out there.
Right.
It's easy to get lost in the theological weeds.
You're absolutely right. There are a lot of different perspectives on this.
Right.
Some people believe Romans 11.26 is talking about a mass conversion of Jewish people at the end of time.
Okay.
Others see it as a more gradual process, something that's already happening. And others interpret it as the restoration of Israel as a nation,
Right.
not necessarily every individual Jew.
Yeah, so how do we navigate all these different views,
That's a good question.
especially when they seem to contradict each other?
Right. That's where humility comes in.
Yeah.
And a willingness to listen.
Okay.
We need to approach these different interpretations with an open mind
Right.
and realize that we're dealing with a mystery here.
Okay.
We're not going to have all the answers this side of heaven, but we can carefully examine the text, consider the historical context,
Right.
and be open to the possibility that God's ways are higher than our ways.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think the olive tree analogy is really helpful here.
Yeah, I think so too.
It reminds us that both Jews and Gentiles are part of God's plan. We're all grafted into the same tree.
Exactly. And that's one of the beautiful things about Romans 11. It's a
Yeah.
message of unity and reconciliation. It reminds us that God's love is big enough for everyone,
Right.
Jew and Gentile alike.
Speaking of which, you know those FAQs we pulled up?
Yeah.
What was that one about the significance of the remnant again?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Could you remind me of that?
Yeah, the remnant refers to that portion of Israel who remained faithful to God
Right.
throughout their history, even when most turned away from him.
Yeah.
It's a powerful reminder that God always preserves a faithful people for himself,
Yeah.
even in the darkest of times.
And it's not just any random group, right?
Right, exactly.
They're chosen by God's grace.
Romans 11.5 specifically says,
Mhm.
according to the election of grace,
Okay.
God chooses them not because they've earned it or deserve it,
Right.
but purely out of his own free and undeserved favor.
Yeah. It's amazing.
It's a beautiful reminder that salvation is a gift from God. It's not something we can achieve through our own efforts.
Such an important point.
Yeah.
It totally dismantles any idea that we can somehow earn our way into God's good graces.
Right.
It's all about his grace, his initiative,
Right.
his love reaching out to us.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's not about being a good enough Jew or Gentile.
No.
It's about God's sovereign choice.
Right.
His choice to love us and draw us to himself.
Precisely. And that's good news for all of us.
That is good news.
It means no one is excluded from God's grace.
Yeah.
It's available to everyone who believes, regardless of their background or ethnicity.
That's a beautiful truth.
It is.
So circling back to the Gentiles being grafted in,
Yeah.
there was another question in those FAQs
Okay.
about how this inclusion relates to the Jewish people
Right.
in God's overall plan.
Right.
Some people think it diminishes their role or importance.
That's a common misunderstanding, but it's so important to emphasize that
Yeah.
the inclusion of the Gentiles is not meant to replace the Jewish people. It's not a new plan that overrides the old covenant.
Okay.
Instead, it's part of God's original design
Yeah.
to bless all nations through Abraham and his descendants. Remember God's promise to Abraham in Genesis 12:3, "In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed."
Right.
Paul is showing us how that promise is being fulfilled
Yeah.
through the inclusion of the Gentiles.
So it's not a replacement, but an expansion,
Exactly.
like widening the circle to include more people in God's blessing.
Yes, it's like expanding the table to make room for more guests at the feast.
Okay, yeah.
And Paul makes it very clear that this inclusion of the Gentiles ultimately benefits the Jewish people as well.
Now that's interesting. It seems counterintuitive.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah. How can including other people benefit the ones who seem to be getting less attention?
That's where the idea of provoking them to jealousy comes into play.
Right.
Paul suggests that seeing God's grace extended to the Gentiles
Mm-hmm.
might draw the Jewish people back to their own Messiah,
Okay.
the one they rejected.
Right.
It's like God's using, you could say, a little reverse psychology.
Yeah, I like how you put that. Reverse psychology.
To stir up their hearts and awaken them to the truth.
It's like God is saying, look at what you're missing. Don't you want to be part of this incredible family too?
Exactly. And ultimately, the goal is the salvation of all Israel.
Right.
Like it says in Romans 11:26, it's such a beautiful picture of God's heart for his people.
It is.
Yeah.
So bringing it back to the olive tree,
Okay.
the Gentiles being grafted in,
Mm-hmm.
that's not a permanent situation, is it?
No, it's not.
There's this sense of movement, anticipation.
You're picking up on something important there.
Yeah.
It's temporary.
Okay.
That's one of the key insights from the olive tree analogy.
Right.
Even though those wild branches, the Gentiles, have been grafted in, they're still dependent on the root of the tree, which represents Israel.
Okay.
Paul's very clear about this in Romans 11:18 when he says, "Do not boast over the branches. If you do, consider this. You do not support the root, but the root supports you."
Right.
In other words, the Gentiles can't survive without that connection to Israel. They're drawing life and nourishment from that root.
So again, it's this picture of interdependence, not replacement.
Exactly.
It's not about the Gentiles coming in and taking over. It's about both groups being united in Christ, drawing life from the same source.
Yes.
And ultimately, the goal is the restoration of those original branches,
Right.
the Jewish people, back into their rightful place.
Exactly. Romans 11:23 puts it this way. "And if they do not persist in unbelief, they will be grafted in, for God is able to graft them in again."
Wow.
God's ultimate plan is to reunite all of his people, both Jew and Gentile, into this one glorious family.
That is a beautiful image of God's redemptive work.
It is.
Now, there's another piece of this puzzle that I think often trips people up.
Okay.
This idea of a blindness that has fallen on Israel. There was a question in the FAQs about that. Like, what does that actually mean?
Right.
Does it mean they literally can't see or understand the truth about Jesus?
It's not a physical blindness, but a spiritual one.
Okay.
Paul's describing a hardening of their hearts that keeps them from recognizing Jesus as the Messiah.
Right.
But he makes it clear that this blindness is partial.
Okay.
It doesn't apply to every single Jewish person.
Right, because there's always that faithful remnant.
Exactly.
So it's not like God has completely shut them out.
Yeah,
There's still hope, a way back to him.
absolutely. And that hope is rooted in God's faithfulness to his promises.
Right.
Even though Israel has stumbled, God hasn't abandoned them.
Right.
He's working behind the scenes to bring about their ultimate salvation.
So it's like this temporary veil that will one day be lifted,
Yeah, good way to put it.
allowing them to see the truth clearly.
Exactly. Romans 11:25 tells us this blindness will last until the full number of the Gentiles has come in.
The full number of the Gentiles. Now, that's another phrase packed with meaning.
It is.
What does that refer to?
It's the idea that there's a certain number of Gentiles God has predetermined to bring into his kingdom.
Okay.
And once that number is reached, the blindness on Israel will be lifted,
Wow.
and they'll turn to their Messiah.
So The salvation of the Gentiles is actually a key part
It is.
of God's plan to bring about the salvation of Israel.
Precisely. It's like a domino effect.
Wow.
The inclusion of the Gentiles sets off this chain of events that ultimately leads to the restoration of Israel.
And it all comes back to God's incredible grace and wisdom.
Yes.
Working together in ways we can't always fully comprehend.
Absolutely. The way he weaves together these seemingly disparate threads.
Right.
Israel's rejection, the Gentiles' inclusion, the blindness, the full number.
That's a lot.
It's all part of his grand design.
It really is mind-blowing. And I love how Paul, at the end of Romans 11, basically throws his hands up in the air and says, okay, God, you win. Your ways are way beyond anything we could have imagined.
Right. It's this beautiful moment of surrender and adoration. He's acknowledging that God's wisdom and knowledge are infinitely greater than ours.
And even when we don't understand everything, we can still trust in the one who does.
Absolutely. That's such an encouraging thought.
It is.
Especially when we're grappling with these complex theological concepts.
Right, exactly.
It leads us into the last section of Romans 11.
Okay.
Where Paul addresses this seemingly paradoxical truth.
Right.
About Israel's relationship with God.
Oh, you mean where he talks about them being both enemies and beloved?
Yes.
That one really threw me for a loop the first time I read it.
Yeah.
How can someone be both at the same time?
It is a paradox, for sure.
Yeah.
But it's a paradox that reveals the complexity of God's heart.
Okay.
And his unwavering love for his people.
Mm-hmm.
Should we unpack that a bit?
Let's do it.
All
I'm
right.
ready for more mind-blowing insights.
All right. Absolutely. Let's dive into that paradox. Romans 11.28 offers a key to understanding this tension. It says, as regards the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. But as regards election, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers. So we see two distinct perspectives at play here.
Okay, I'm seeing how that sets up the two sides. But walk me through it. What does it mean to be enemies in the context of the gospel?
Well, from the perspective of the gospel message, some Jewish people are considered enemies because they haven't accepted Jesus as the Messiah. Their rejection puts them at odds with the very message of salvation that Paul is proclaiming.
That makes sense. But how can they be beloved at the same time? It seems contradictory.
That's where the second part of the verse comes in. As regards election, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers. This speaks to God's unconditional choice of Israel as his special people, a choice rooted in his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's a love that stretches back generations.
So even though they haven't embraced Jesus as the Messiah, God still loves them because of his faithfulness to his promises made long ago.
Exactly. And Romans 11.29 drives this point home even further. For God's gifts and his call are irrevocable. In other words, God doesn't go back on his promises. His love for Israel is unwavering even when they stray from him.
That's a powerful image of God's steadfast love. It's a love that transcends our understanding. A love that persists even when we reject him.
It truly is. It reminds us that God's love isn't based on our performance or our ability to get it right. It's rooted in his unchanging character and his faithfulness to his word.
It makes you think about that verse in Romans 11.32 where Paul says that God has consigned all to disobedience, that he may have mercy on all. That one's always been a bit of a head-scratcher for me. Is Paul suggesting that God deliberately made everyone disobedient?
That's a great question. And it's one that has sparked a lot of debate over the centuries. It's not that God forced anyone into disobedience, but that he allowed both Jews and Gentiles to experience the consequences of their sin, which ultimately leads to separation from him, in a sense. He allowed them to reach a point where they were utterly dependent on his mercy.
So it's like he's leveling the playing field, showing both Jews and Gentiles that they're equally in need of his grace.
Exactly. And that's why Paul bursts into praise in the final verses of Romans 11. He's overwhelmed by the depth of God's wisdom and knowledge, by the intricate way he's orchestrated everything to bring about the salvation of both Jews and Gentiles. It's a grand, sweeping plan that unfolds across history.
It's amazing to see how it all fits together, how God is working out his purposes even when we can't see the full picture.
It is. And that's the beauty of studying a passage like Romans 11. It pushes us to expand our thinking, to grapple with the mystery and complexity of God's ways.
So after this deep dive into Romans 11, what's the one takeaway you'd want our listeners to remember? What's the heart of it all?
I think the most important thing to remember is that God's plan is bigger than any one group of people. It encompasses all of humanity, both Jews and Gentiles. And his love is wide enough to embrace everyone, regardless of their background or their current beliefs.
Beautifully said. And I think it's crucial to recognize that this chapter raises more questions than it answers, which is part of what makes it so captivating. It invites us to keep exploring the mystery of God's plan, to wrestle with the complexities of His Word, and to stand in awe of His unfathomable grace.
And if this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, don't stop here. Pick up a good commentary, join a Bible study, or simply spend some time reflecting on the text. There's always more to uncover in God's Word.
That's such great advice. So, to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this journey through Romans 11. It's been a wild and thought-provoking ride. Until next time, keep seeking, keep questioning, and keep diving deep into the mysteries of God's amazing grace.
Right. Let's unpack that a little bit. Romans 11.28 gives us a key to understanding this tension. Where it says, as regards the gospel, they are enemies for your sake. But as regards election, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers. So we see these two different perspectives happening at the same time.
Okay, I see how that sets up those two sides. But explain that a little more. What does it mean to be enemies when we're talking about the gospel?
Well, when we look at it from the perspective of the gospel message, some Jewish people are considered enemies because they haven't accepted Jesus as the Messiah. And that rejection actually puts them in opposition to the message of salvation that Paul's preaching.
Okay, I get that. But how can they also be beloved at the same time? It seems like those two things can't both be true.
That's where that second part of the verse comes in. As regards election, they are beloved for the sake of their forefathers. This is about God's choice of Israel as His special people, and it's a choice that's rooted in His covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It's a love that goes way back.
So even though they haven't accepted Jesus as the Messiah, God still loves them because He's staying true to the promises He made way back then.
Exactly. And Romans 11.29 makes that even more clear. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. He doesn't back out of His promises. His love for Israel doesn't change, even when they wander away from Him.
That's a really powerful image of God's love. It's a love that we can't fully wrap our minds around, a love that sticks with us, even when we reject Him.
It really is. It reminds us that God's love isn't based on how well we perform or if we get things right. It's grounded in His character and in His faithfulness to His word.
That makes me think about Romans 11.32, where Paul says, God has consigned all to disobedience, that He may have mercy on all. That one's always confused me a little. Is he saying God purposely made everyone disobedient?
That's a great question, and it's definitely caused a lot of discussion over the years. It's not that God forced people into disobedience, but He let both Jews and Gentiles experience the consequences of their sin. And that ultimately leads to separation from Him. So in a way, He allowed them to get to a point where they were completely dependent on His mercy.
So it's like He's evening the playing field, showing both Jews and Gentiles that they need His grace equally.
Exactly. And that's why Paul breaks out into this praise in those final verses of Romans 11. He's blown away by the depth of God's wisdom and knowledge, by the intricate way He's put everything together to bring about the salvation of both Jews and Gentiles. It's this grand plan that plays out through all of history.
It really is amazing to see how it all fits together, how God's working out His purposes, even when we can't see the whole picture.
It is. And that's what makes studying a passage like Romans 11 so amazing. It makes us think bigger, to wrestle with the mystery and complexity of God's ways.
So after going this deep into Romans 11, what's the one big thing you'd want our listeners to take away? What's at the heart of it all?
Well, I think the most important thing to remember is that God's plan is bigger than just one group of people. It includes all of humanity, both Jews and Gentiles. His love is big enough for everyone, no matter their background or what they believe right now.
That's a great way to put it. And I think it's important to remember that this chapter gives us more questions than answers, which is part of what makes it so fascinating. It keeps us digging deeper into the mystery of God's plan, to wrestle with the complex parts of His Word, and to stand in awe of His incredible grace.
And if this deep dive has piqued your interest, don't stop here. There are commentaries you can read, Bible studies to join, or just spend some time meditating on the text. God's Word always has more to reveal to us.
That's such great advice. So to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this journey through Romans 11. It's been a wild ride full of thought-provoking ideas.
Yeah.
Until next time, keep searching, keep asking questions, and keep going deep into the mysteries of God's amazing grace.